Well, now we're going to veer off the road in an entirely different direction. And Matt, I will say that
Yeah.
I was completely unfamiliar with the Monks
Yeah.
and made it a point to stay unfamiliar with the Monks all the way up until you talking right now. So while I listen to this album, I wanted to go in cold with no background because it is so rare for me to
Yeah.
not at least have some cursory knowledge and not to pat myself on the back. But I was really excited. So I, much like the listeners, am really excited to see what's going on with this band and give my thoughts on it. So I'm
John,
going to turn the reins over to you, my friend.
John, you know what time it is?
Monk's time. It's
It's
Black
monk
Monk
time.
time. Yeah.
You're darn tootin'. It's monk time, and that's
I
how it
blew my cue
starts.
there, man. I had
Yeah.
it set up for me and I blew it. So, Black Monk time. Yep.
It's monk time. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
how the album starts essentially. So the Monks. Wow. So this is a band that this album
And
Black
expect me
Monk
to ask
Time.
1,000
Yeah.
questions, Matt. So if you don't know the answer to it,
Yeah.
we'll just throw it out to the listeners, or
It'll
we're gonna
be
have a hell of a Matt's
a
tidbits
lot of
later.
stacks to clean later on for
Yes,
sure.
exactly.
Yeah. So this album was released in March of 1966. And so this band was
okay.
comprised of 5 American GIs who were stationed in Germany. They were all
Really?
they were all in the army.
Okay.
And none of them, it didn't seem, I actually watched
That
today.
is very interesting, the German influence, and I'll get there later,
Yes.
but go ahead. Yep.
So I watched a documentary on them today because the more I've learned about them, the more fascinated I got. So I did find a documentary called The Transatlantic Feedback.
Okay.
And so I got more information from that, and that's something if you like this or you're interested in all, that's a really good documentary. You can find it on it was on Amazon Prime Video. Okay. So, but yes,
and you said this was their only album.
Their only album, correct?
Wow. Okay.
So you have 5 American GIs, all of which essentially joined the army, not necessarily out of any sense of patriotism or wanting to, kill the commies, because that's basically what this time period, right? You're in the early 60s, and this is really Cold War, Kennedy, Cuban Missile Crisis, era that they were in the army.
They joined, right?
That they joined.
The album came out later. Okay, gotcha.
Right, yeah. So they're in the army before they're really the Monks. But they joined because they just all wanted to get out of the States. They wanted something different. They wanted to tour, the world or see different parts of the world. They were all kind of in some way, shape, or form dissatisfied with where they were in the States. And then they just met each other as, GIs in Germany. So the band consisted of the 2 main guys were Gary Berger, who played the guitar and vocals, and Dave Day, who was a rhythm guitarist, but as their sound morphed, he ended up playing mainly the 6-string electric banjo. Was his
6-string electric banjo?
Correct. Most banjos.
Electric and banjo, 6-string and banjo. That there's more oxymorons I can keep up with. There.
I know, and it's because most banjos, I believe, are 4 strings. So this was a 6-string electric banjo.
Well, and the whole reason you go banjo, right, is not to go electric or to supplement the electric. Correct?
Not when you're the Monks. Nope.
Not when you're the Monks. Right?
It's not the normal banjo that you and I know. So then the other 3 members were Larry Clark, who played the organ, Eddie Shaw, who was the bass player, and Roger Johnston, who was the drum player, drummer, not drum player. So they kind of all just met, as GIs in Germany. They started playing together. They played some different. And eventually they got out of the army, and they started playing in Germany. They stayed in Germany afterwards. They didn't want to go back to the States, and they ended up playing these small clubs. And a lot of what they were playing was just music of the time. They did a lot of covers, even though that, Dave Day and Gary Berger still were writing songs and, kind of starting to write songs together, but they did a lot of, kind of beat music. They were covering the Stones, they were covering the Beatles, they were doing the Beach Boys, and they.
I'm sure they were listening to the Animals too, because with the organ and stuff, there aren't altogether. It's not by any means an exact anything on this album, but you could see that there might be some influence there.
Yeah, so they were basically just a regular, cover rock band, right? But then one day, there are 2 Germans that came, kind of almost like businessmen, that came in to see a show in 1965. Their names were Carl Remy and Walter Niemann, and they had 2 vastly different personalities. So you had Carl was kind of this boisterous, crazy, energetic, extrovert, and Walter was more of a, of a quieter guy. But they
like
both
stereotypical German.
Yeah. Yes. Right. More stereotypical German. But they, they saw these guys and they were looking on a project. They approached the band after a show and said that, we're working on this project and we're trying to create this band. And so, these guys weren't finding it. They weren't making a ton of money, and they were just, they were open.
So they're
to anything,
basically
really.
just a well-regarded cover band playing to German audiences and GI audiences. Is that a fair description?
Essentially,
okay.
Yes. And maybe throwing in some of their, they, like I said, they had some songs that they were working on. And I think that maybe even some of them were the ones that ended up on this album, but they were definitely different versions of it, because these guys, so they were originally called what was the original band name? They weren't the Monks originally.
Okay.
I have to give me a second. I'll figure that out. Oh, the Torquays, and that was named after a song by a band called the Fireballs, which was kind of an instrumental, almost like a surf band, I believe, surf music, surf song. But these guys kind of came in and said they had this vision of the Monks, right? So they really, and I got to give you some descriptions of what the sound is, because there's so many different ways to describe it, but I picked up on a lot of things watching the documentary. So they really wanted this to be. Yeah, go ahead.
Before other people define it, I want to have the opportunity to define it myself, and it doesn't have to be now, but I almost don't want to be led in the direction of how other people describe it.
Well, John, how would you define this? Because I have it all written down here, the different adjectives. How would you describe it?
I almost have to just plow in, because, like I said, I came in with no knowledge of this. And as I'm listening to it, my brain is a referential brain to begin with. So while I'm listening to it and gathering stuff, my first listen is often, what does this sound like? What's the background? And it is, at times, it's krautrock, like Kraftwerk and audiences in that genre, Faust, right? It very much sounds like Kraftwerk, like complex, discordant, but also in some ways very precise. And so that's why when you said they're German GIs, I'm like, wow, okay, interesting, because one of the first things that came to mind to me was that krautrock sound.
Yes.
At times you hear stuff that would later would come, like, for example, the song London's Burning by The Clash, right? There is a song on this album, track number 4, that is literally the lead-in to that song. So to the point where Higgledy Piggledy, right, is at the beginning, it's, London's burning, and you hear it exactly the same chord structure, right? Mm-hmm. So it also sounds not only like that first wave of punk, but also at times I was like, God, the only thing I compare this to is like the first time I heard the Dead Kennedys, in the sense that it's entertaining, but it's that, like, I guess the term would be like proto-punk type sound. So there's like krautrock, there's proto-punk. It's a throwback to with the organ and stuff, like the Animals. That's why it's interesting we paired them together. At times they get very tuneful and structured, and then they fly off the chart. And there's specific songs I'll talk about. I won't get into it now, but I'm fascinated to hear what other people think, because they're one of the few bands I could not put a thumb on, but I could say, wow, like, clearly people were listening to this band, because you hear elements of this band all over the place, especially the 70s.
And you hit a lot of the terms, right? So
okay.
Krautrock.
And I promise I didn't. Well, yeah. I mean, you can't miss the krautrock. I mean,
they were and they were influential. The Dead Kennedys listed as one of
really,
one of the big, influenced heavily by. You know who else listed that they were influenced by these guys was the Beastie Boys, which I found interesting as well. But and
I could see that though, because they were the Beastie Boys at the big. Right after, License to Ill. Well, they were a punk band, but they were also right after License to Ill and before Ill Communication. They have a lot of stuff that's very avant-garde, and that what this album can be is avant-garde at times.
That's
for
another
sure.
term. Yep.
Is it really?
Yes,
I
it is.
promise I didn't do my research.
You're hitting
Maybe
all this. Well, you know
Okay.
music, so you're hitting on the right things here. So what has been described as is gritty, rhythmically oriented music with high rhythm, high energy. One of the members of the band basically said everybody was contributing towards the rhythm. So if you were playing something that wasn't contributing towards the rhythm, it wasn't part of the Monks'
But
sound.
at no point would I have identified a banjo as being in this. Like, I'm trying to think of any of the songs and see where there would be a callback to it. So my only thought can be, does the electric 6-string banjo even sound like a banjo? Because I didn't hear it.
In a very slight sense, because what it's really doing, it's part of the rhythm, obviously, with everything else. But it's kind of a muted sound. It's not like he's strumming hard on it, but then he's hammering down on the neck, so he's not letting the notes and the chords ring out. It's like ching, 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 and it's like a metallic sound to it as well. So you can definitely hear it. And if you watch John, if you didn't do any research, I encourage you or anybody else, you can watch these guys play on YouTube videos and stuff at the time. And it's
I'm going to, trust me.
Fascinating to watch these guys play. And so when you see that, you'll be able to see, Day play the electric banjo.
So is he hammering? You said he's hammering down on it. Like, is it sort of like how a punk band, like the way they play, just that furious strumming?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, I guess so, because and it's just going right in line with the rhythm. It's just very fast, and he's stomping his feet, and it's
well, for like modern audiences, you think of like the way Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day plays, right? Like hammering on, and for classics, Joe Strummer, who obviously influenced them. When you watch them play, they attack the instrument, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what it looks like? Or
I would think so. I mean, he's not. I mean, he's moving a good portion of his arm. He's not just strumming, with just like a little bit of his wrist. Like he's moving his whole arm up and down and going. He's going at it, right?
Windmilling, like Townsend style.
Not quite windmilling. I don't think he was quite there yet. But So some other ways of describing this. Was that it was distorted, loud, non-melodic. Few cymbals, lots of tom-tom drums. So the drums were very much a lot of tom-toms.
I mean, it could be. It's not as much of a callback to noise rock as some of the other stuff, later would be, and certainly like krautrock would be in some ways. But I could see how there's even elements of that. There isn't the feedback and stuff as much, but the like you said, the discordant nature of it is sort of like that. It's a challenge to listen to because we want it to be a challenge to listen to.
I don't think. I mean, even the first time I heard it, I was kind of like very intrigued, but I wasn't sure if I liked it.
I did. I immediately liked it.
Really, right away. Yeah. So, but it's not something for the faint of heart, right? It's definitely hits you, and you're like, this is 1966, and in some ways it sounds like 1966, and in other ways,
I think it sounds like 1976 is much more, because it's like it's 10 years early with what this sounds like. Because like I said, you could have placed this in the krautrock era and when punk was beginning, and this album would have made sense. In 1966, this album doesn't make any sense, which is why I'm shocked I don't know anything about this, because even obscure bands that would come later, right? You'd learn more about, like whether it be, I hate to keep going up, but like, bands like Suicide and stuff, who their reputations far exceed, what they sold or stuff at the time. They still drive your consciousness, but this band somehow didn't. And so, man, talk about like an unexpected gift that then influenced the hell of while I'm not a huge krautrock enthusiast, a lot of the other stuff that clearly was there is stuff that I ended up loving. And it's funny that the Dead Kennedys said it, because I absolutely see it, because I had the same reaction to it that I did the first time I heard the Dead Kennedys when I was like 12 years old, right? It was like, this, I don't know what this is, but I want to hear more of it.
Well, and I found it interesting too that when they went into the studio, so a lot of this again was driven by those two Germans, right? That Carl and Walter, that said that this is kind of in the electric banjo, that was their idea. These were relatively, and it's kind of funny because you wouldn't think this when you listen to the music, but they were relatively just normal dudes, right? They were just regular guys like playing music.
But were they disaffected because the lyrics,
no. Right?
The lyrics are very charged, and I was able to make out a lot of them early, but then the second time I listened to it, I had them up, and the lyrics are very straightforward in the way. I mean, I keep talking about the Dead Kennedys, but that's kind of what it's like. It's got the sneer of like a Replacements, like a disaffectedness of the Replacements, with the directness in terms of how the words are said of like Dead Kennedys. Mm-hmm. And I actually, the song Shut Up, like sounds both in words and how it sounds lyrically like a domestic violence like episode. Yeah. It really does. Yeah, like, you're reading the lyrics and then you're hearing it, and it's like this is the musical equivalent of like domestic violence.
Yeah, for sure. But I think obviously some of the ideas were there. I know that one of the band members, mentioned Eddie Shaw, the bass player, said that he was not really particularly fond of the anti-Vietnam stuff, because that comes right off the bat, right? You start this album, it's Monk time, and he's like, and why we got to, and like the third thing he says is, why do we have to kill all those kids in Vietnam, right?
Well, and it's spoken word, and so you're thinking, okay, it's gonna, and then Shut Up goes a totally different direction and is equally as explicit about just hating a partner.
There's a lot of hate. In this album.
Including a song called I Hate You, which is about what you expect it's about. Yeah.
Do you know why I hate you? Because you make me hate you. Like that's his reason why.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like nihilistic, which is a lot of the lyrics have a like nihilistic component.
Yeah, no, for sure. And but a lot of this was just crafted by those two managers. They had this vision, and they encouraged them for a much more minimalist sound. So what they did was they took their songs and they worked on deconstructing them. So they wanted to narrow it down so that they weren't, playing as many chords. They wanted to narrow down the amount of words that they were using, and they wanted it just to be repetitive. So let's cut down on the number of words, but let's just keep repeating the same things over and over again. So that was very calculated. And, they just worked out very simple beats and progressions, and they said they purposefully worked for tension. And that was, I thought, a really good way of describing it, because that's what it is. This is not a smooth, laid back, type of sound. This kind of is jarring. And as a result, they were not well received, of course, even in Germany. They said they would go play these shows after they released their album, and they were like going into their performances that they were going to be mostly hated. And they got to the point where they hated playing because they were just like, everybody's just going to hate us. So like, let's just do this and get out of here and do the next show, So it was very chore-like at that point for them.
Well, the overlap between what sort of the ethos of krautrock was later is very strong there, because we'll talk plenty because it's going to show up in the 70s. But my understanding of that rock music in the 70s in Germany and the krautrock ethos is sort of like breaking away from like American structures, right? Most notably all of the R&B stuff, right? And kind of creating your own version of it. And more Mothers of Invention, Velvet Underground, right, than influenced by like 50s blues and traditional African American rock, right? And that's where krautrock comes in. So it's difficult to listen to at times, right?
Yes,
and sort of draws off of certain types of jazz, which are experimental as well.
Oh, for sure.
But once again, this is a band that seems like it should have ended up there in that era of krautrock, not in 1966, because those guys were basically going off of the idea of what those later, which is why the second you said that, I said, oh, there is a German connection, because I said, there has to be, because this it seems like it should be a brother and sister of it, but it seems like it's even a forerunner. I'd be fascinated to see if those bands.
Well, Velvet Underground was listed as well. That's kind of, it's one of these things where
but they were contemporaries of Velvet Underground, so they wouldn't have been influenced by them, right? Because if this was 66,
right around the same time. Well, there was also something that I read that I'm like, I don't know. There's been several music critics who have credited Berger with creating feedback in records. Okay. And I'm like, well, I always thought that was the Beatles, because, in late 64, the Beatles, released I Feel Fine. and that starts with feedback. So I don't know
Well,
about
there
that.
was
I mean, they certainly probably used more distortion, certainly than a lot of other, acts at the time. But, but the other thing too, is I thought was interesting, and I didn't realize this when I listened to it, but when I read it, I said, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the background vocals were supposed to be reminiscent of chanting monks almost, like that was part of the, part of the sound. So if you go back and listen, I Hate You's a great example, right? The background, I hate you, baby. And then they're like, but call me. And it's a very, it's like a chanty kind of thing. And we haven't even talked about the image, John, because in addition to shocking people musically, this was very shocking with their image, because not only did these guys craft their sound or really push them in that direction, that minimalist, rhythmic direction, but they wanted them to be actual monks, right? So they dressed them up in these black robes. They wore rope ties around their necks. So they had these ties that were ropes. And then to cap it all off, their hairstyle was reminiscent of a monk. So they grew their hair long, kind of like mop top Beatle haircuts. And then they shaved the tops of their heads like Catholic monks or Gregorian monks or whatever, so that they had these really bizarre haircuts. And people felt that this image was blasphemous and didn't take to, and so, and in addition to that, so then the managers,
so they were performance artists as well, it sounds like.
Yeah. And the managers not only wanted them to have this persona on stage, but they also wanted them to carry that with them in their regular, ordinary lives. And so they provided the band with rules, the rules of being a monk, and they're just ridiculous. It's so funny. It's very straightforward in a very German way. So in public, you always have to be a monk is one of the rules, right? Which means you're dressed black, you have your hair short, always move like a monk, which is hard, sexy, strong, exciting, full speed, dangerous, not just on stage, but on the street. And
I
finally,
to
never be a Torquay.
Yes, I just apologize to our German listeners, but can you not hear a German guy speaking in English? Like just saying, always be a monk, strong, sexy, vibrant, you know what I mean? Like kind of that whole idea. And it's just funny, like you've got these American GIs who are looking to kind of like buck the routine of structure, it sounds like. And here they end up with this whole lifestyle choice that in its own way is equally as structured in a different way than the military in their art.
Yeah. And they wanted them to be like the opposite of what was good. They wanted to have a mysterious aura and be nonconformist and just be like very little melody. I know last week I was talking about, how the MC5 was a little bit of a hard listen to me because I couldn't find any melody. There's not much more melody here.
No.
But I found this, the more I listened to it, I was grooving a little bit. Like there is some melody and the rhythm is just so good. And it got to the point where it just, for certain songs, it got infectious for me. And I think,
and there's a lot of rhythm. I wouldn't say there's a lot of melody. And there's a
couple of things here and there. And I was saying that last week, like, I don't need a ton of melody. I don't need this like lush harmonies and things. And that's what's funny too, because they were covering, before they were the Monks, they were covering the Beach Boys, right? And the Beatles and this stuff that's totally like, and they ended up going in the complete opposite direction of that type of sound. But no, the more I listened to this, the more I liked it. I think that there's not much on, there's a 4-track, I think, when it goes from I Hate You, what is it? Oh, How Do You Do?
Oh,
How to Do Now?
How to Do Now, yep.
Complication, which I thought, I was hearing the Pixies in that, man. That sounded like a Frank Black kind of a, Pixies type song.
I mean, we can keep going, and there's Pixies, Husker Du elements to this in there as well. That complicated listen. I heard bits and pieces of all kinds of stuff that you could basically do like at the risk of this sounding like one of those obnoxious Pitchfork reviews. You know what I mean? You can go in 1,000 different directions if you've been exposed to a lot of different stuff, and that's what fascinated me about this.
Well, let me ask you this, because there was another part of the documentary where they had the producer of the album went to go see a show before they recorded, and he was this is too loud, this is just noise, I don't know how we're going to record this. And then he had to leave the club. It was too much for him, so he goes outside, and being outside with the the noise level down, being a little bit more muffled, he heard what they were doing better, and he said, okay, well, this is how I can record them. And he mentioned in the documentary that he's like, this wasn't a term then. He goes, but this was early heavy metal. And later on, somebody also described them as being early like techno music, which
definitely can see the second in terms of certain types of I wouldn't necessarily say techno as much as I'd say electronic music. Even though this isn't electronic, it's that same ethos of just a lot of sound coming at you discordantly, but with that repetitiveness that marks sort of,
right.
Especially the like 90s techno or electronic, I'd say. I don't hear metal in this.
Yeah,
I really don't. I think this. I don't want to give it I think it's a lot more beholden to that krautrock / elements of punk rock, especially the punk rock that is played to not be melodic. And like we said, Dead Kennedys comes to mind, a little bit of Minor Threat, stuff like that. Metal, on the other hand, for the most part, I feel like always ties together a lot nicer. Even
well, I think that's
harsh
probably
metal.
I think he's saying that more. It's just it's like the heavier sound of it, right? That was just not. They were using a lot of equipment that amplified things to a much higher degree.
I mean,
than other bands.
me, it's loud but not heavy,
right?
If that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and I can see that too, but I thought that was interesting. I was like, geez, we're going all over the place with the crediting here. But I just think it's cool because this is a band, and one of the reasons that you said you never heard of them, I mean, the album was not released in the U.S.
Okay.
In the initial print, there was concern that the lyrical content was too troublesome for U.S. audiences.
Yeah, especially track 1. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't even have got past that.
Yeah, so they essentially the breakup of the band. I think that's interesting too, because the Carl, one of the managers, ended up he had a drinking problem, and he was very mercurial in his personality, and he and the
you
other
don't say
manager,
with that business plan.
Yeah, well, he and the other manager, Walter, they began to have a falling out. So Carl leaves, and so it leaves the more the modest, quiet guy in the background, and he kind of just fades out. And so they were really kind of instrumental, because when the band did feel like, what are we doing? Because they took on these personas because they were asked to, not because they really felt like this is who we are. So they kind of felt ridiculous. and so every time that they kind of got down, the managers would come in and they would say all the right things, and then they would leave and they'd be like, we're monks. Now let's go back and be the monks, And so with that partnership disbanded, that was gone, right? And so they were finally they toured in Europe. They never played the US until a reunion show in 2000. They played a show in New York in 32 years after they broke up, because they ended up breaking up. They were supposed to tour in Asia and in Vietnam. And right when they were at the airport, they received a card from the drummer, Johnston, and he basically said, "I can't take this anymore. I quit." So and then they were like, "All right, we're done." Right. So then that was it. They didn't really, and I think that they kind of, that was probably going to be coming anyway at a certain point, not too far down the road. But yeah, so it was one album. They did do a couple of other songs, because the record company came back and said, you guys, this is not selling. This is too harsh. You need to do something a little poppier, and which they did. So if you listen beyond, John, if you listen to the bonus stuff, but some of those tracks are on the bonus feature of the Spotify version, and it just sounds totally different, and it's not good,
I did. Yeah,
right?
I did. And it was not nearly as compelling as you could tell it was designed. I wasn't aware that it was to be more accessible, but I thought that it was just discarded stuff as they were trying to figure out their ethos a little bit, but it makes sense that it would be the other end as well.
It was the record company saying, hey guys, clean this up, so they broke up, and and it's one of those things that over decades, it started to grow a little bit more in popularity. People started, they did start re-releasing.
Because this album was re-recorded by about 150 different bands in like little increments.
Yes,
so that's why it starts to come back, I'm sure, because like I said, it's everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah. So, but they did
in terms of influences.
Yeah, but they did do a show in 2000, and they did continue to tour a little bit.
Can you imagine how hipsterish that show must have been in 2000 in New York? It must have been just a tremendous audience.
Well, they've got footage of it. They interviewed a couple of artists that I like, John Spencer from the John Spencer Blues, like some artists like that are kind of like you might have heard of, but aren't like, huge artists that come to mind. But yeah, so they were able to continue to play a little bit, but eventually fizzled out. I got a kick out of this too, that the main guy Berger eventually became Gary Berger eventually became the mayor of a town called Turtle River in Minnesota.
River, Minnesota. Okay.
From 2006 until his death in 2014 from pancreatic cancer. So, yeah, 3 of the guys have passed away, but it's just a fascinating story. And it's one of those things that the more you learn, the more you're going, this is real. Like, this was an actual real thing.
Well, I think you've locked in the story, which is compelling, but the takeaway for me on this is what this album sounds like. Yeah. This was a fascinating listen. And if you like avant-garde music or 70s krautrock or even punk, you're gonna like this album, and it's gonna be like a nice gift under the proverbial Christmas tree for you when you're not expecting it, because wow, it was really good. The story is fascinating in its own right, but by itself, if this album wasn't interesting, it would have been sort of an interesting novelty, right?
Well, there's everything about this is interesting to me. It's just like it's the whole thing. Did you have any? Were there any standout tracks for you, John, in particular? Or
I liked quite a few songs on the album. And the interesting thing too is I liked quite a lot. It's almost the opposite of what we just talked about with the Animals, in that it was not samey at all in terms of as you progress through it. Once you thought you had a handle on it, you realized quickly you had absolutely no handle on it whatsoever. You know what I mean? And that's why it was like, holy cow, like, how am I going to talk about this on the podcast? Because I love the song Complication.
Yeah.
Was probably my favorite song on it.
That was the single.
What was it? Okay, gotcha. Okay, I would not have guessed, because what the hell is a single on this album? You know what I mean? So that's not some great insight so much as I just like it. And can you imagine that being released as a single? I just can't imagine.
It didn't do well.
Well, it's like, like you take Frank Zappa, and that stuff wasn't charting, you know what I mean? And this stuff's stranger than even that was. Shut Up was excellent. I liked Boys Are Boys and Girls Are Choice, which almost had sort of like a kind of, what the Jesus and Mary Chain and like Ravenettes did later, you know what I mean? That sound, there's a little of that going. So that's right up my alley. I like that. Higgledy Piggledy was a really interesting song, even though there weren't a lot of lyrics on it. Even later on, when I liked Drunken Maria, it was short, but was a totally different veer. So I could say more about what I liked than what didn't stand out. And there weren't any tracks I didn't hate, because everything was interesting.
I thought Blast Off was a little bit much with all the noise stuff going in the back. Like I was having trouble, because that wasn't as much.
Yeah, but if you think of it as like, as every track they're doing all this crazy shit, it's just okay. That's another one where they're doing this crazy shit.
It's a different type of crazy. Yeah, it's different type of crazy. It didn't resonate with me as much.
And by that point in 11, I'm just expecting crazy shit at that point. You know what I mean? So basically you feed me just about anything, and I'm like, okay, what's next? Because I knew it wasn't going to be what came.
Well, and the lyrics make me laugh too. Like, "That's my girl" is great. Like, he spends the whole time going, "Hey, is that your girl over there? She's a great girl. You're so lucky. She's beautiful. And then later on at the end of the show, he's like, "Wait a minute, that's my girl. You can't have my girl." Right. I laugh when I hear some of the stuff, because it's just, and the guy's voice is great. I love.
It's that very literal stuff that you'd find in later punk music with the edge, but also the literalness of like blues, where it's like we talked about with Robert Johnson, you know what I mean? Where the narrative was straightforward and you knew exactly what was there. There was a little twist and a little tongue in cheek. And it sort of spoke to your like basest emotions or narratives, right? And there's a little bit of that going on with the lyrics as well. Yeah. I know I normally quote the lyrics. I don't have it in front of me right now, but maybe when we clean the stacks, I'll pull out like 2 or 3 of my favorites.
Yeah, no, I think, like I said, I think there was a 4, through from, I Hate You through We Do. I really love those 4 tracks, but yeah, I liked all of it, and it's one of those things that the more I listened to it, the more I liked. I mean, I knew some of the songs. I had heard this album before, but I never really listened to it in earnest like I did in preparation for this. But when I saw it on the list, and I think it's like, yeah, it's like ranked 110. So it's another one of those albums that just missed our countdown. But I was much like when I wanted to do Sweetheart of the Rodeo. I knew there was enough interesting stuff with the sound and with the band that I wanted to, kind of bring this up. And I was very pleased that you knew nothing about it. So I was like, oh man, that's even better. That John, this will be.
And I'll end with this as a music choice. It's fascinating you picked this because this is much more of a John
yes.
pick than a Matt pick. So
yeah, that's why I thought you might have known something about. But yeah, this is one of those things that not a lot of people know about, and I think that's when you hear it, you're like, what the heck, So it's certainly a band that they were around for just a couple years, had one album, and then they went and led regular lives. They didn't really do a whole lot of music afterwards, and but they were able to kind of come back together, do some reunion shows and things like that. So that was kind of good. But
and takeaway from this is listen to this album, and I think we're going to try to get Josh to maybe add some sound for both of these albums tonight compared to our normal bonus.
Oh, that's right. He could probably
albums.
Do that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think this one, unlike some of the other more acoustic versions of what we're trying to do, this one's going to benefit from some sound. So I think we'll hold this one back so you can hear what the monks sound like, and for that matter, the Animals, so you can get a little feel for the dark ethos that I was referencing as well. So any last thoughts, Matt, before we officially close the attic door for this run of shows?
I would just say I will give this a thumbs up, but I definitely know there's going to be a bunch of people that would hate this. This is not for everybody. I don't think. It's very harsh.
I think you already know if you're going to like this album or not. And so the more complicated you like your music, the more you're going to like it. The more you can deal with a cacophony of sound or non-traditional rhythm structures. Some people are saying, all right, get me to it. For other folks, it's like, oof, I don't know. But within the first 3 tracks, you'll know if you're in for it or not. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.